I'm going to tell you a story that's as frustrating as it is heartbreaking. It's the story of how generations of faithful, Yahweh worshiping people got so close to seeing the Messiah and still missed him. They didn't miss him because the evidence wasn't there, it was always there. There's a scroll sitting in a museum in Jerusalem. It was copied before Jesus of Nazareth was born. And what it says about the Messiah is something the rabbis spent 1,000 years trying not to talk about. The ancient Jewish scholars knew something their own descendants were never told. 2,000 years of Jewish scholarship contains a portrait of the Messiah so specific that it names his birthplace, it describes his death, and it fixes the century of his arrival. I'm talking about ancient Jewish writings. Some of them you may have heard of. Maybe you've even read some of them. The Talmud and the Midrash, the Targums, the Zohar, the sacred libraries the rabbis themselves built. And somewhere between 1096 AD and 1200 AD, about 1,000 years ago, what that library said about the Messiah got buried. Not out of deception, I don't think, but out of grief. This is that story. But before we go any further, I want to establish something very, very clearly because it matters for everything else that follows. This is what you might call a disclaimer. This video is not about Jewish people. The average Jewish person across the last 2,000 years received what their scholars handed down to them, in the same way that the average Catholic received what Rome handed to them, and the same way that the average Protestant received what their seminary handed to them. Every person in every tradition inherits filtered versions of their own sacred texts. That's the nature of institutions. For all their benefits of structure and legitimacy, they sometimes perpetuate bad ideas too. By the time you reach the modern period today, the collective interpretation of Isaiah 53 is so thoroughly established as the mainstream Jewish position that most Jewish people have never even heard that any other reading ever existed. They've never been told what Sanhedrin 98b says. They've never read the Hall of the Afflicted in the Zohar. They've never seen Targum Jonathan's rendering of Isaiah 52:13. They simply received what their institutions handed to them. It's the reason we're meant to search the scriptures ourselves. You might even say that we should be Bereans in that way, not just listen to what a religious institution tells us. What I'm examining today are decisions made by scholarly elites at specific moments of crisis. Men in rooms making judgments about what their communities could handle, what was safe to teach, and what was better left alone. Those decisions shaped what an entire people were permitted to see in their own scriptures for generations. I'm going to name those decisions. I'm going to trace them to the wounds that produced them. And I'm going to show you what was sitting in the text before those decisions were made. Now, here's the question that's going to frame everything we do today. If you had nothing but the ancient Jewish texts, no New Testament, no gospel accounts, no letters from Paul, no church fathers, no Christian theology of any kind, what would you expect the Messiah to look like? Where would you think he came from? What do you think would happen to him? Would he suffer and die, or would he conquer and liberate? Honestly, that's a pretty tough question. Even for myself, I would say that most of my understanding of the Messiah comes from New Testament writings or church fathers, or even traditions in the Christian church. It's a tough question to answer because our frame of mind is really our frame of mind. It's difficult to think outside of that. But that's what we're going to find out today. We're going to look at the sources themselves. I want to start by reading you something. It's the foundation of the rest of this story. This is from the prophet Isaiah. Yeah, this is the Old Testament prophet Isaiah, chapter 52, verses 13 through the end of chapter 53. I'm not going to comment on it before I read it. I'm not going to set it up or explain it. I just want you to hear it straightforward. This is in King James translation, by the way. When I'm done, I'm going to ask you one question, so stay tuned for that. All right, let's read Isaiah 52. Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled, and be very high. As many were astonished at thee, his visage was so marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So shall he sprinkle many nations. The kings shall shut their mouths at him, for that which had not been told them shall they see, and that which they had not heard shall they consider. Who hath believed our report? And to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we were healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. And he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days. And the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he hath poured out his soul unto death. And he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. So the question is, who is that? Who is Isaiah 52 and 53 talking about? Again, without looking at your New Testament or your early church writings, who is Isaiah 52 and 53 talking about? That's the question the ancient Jewish world couldn't stop arguing about. And the answer they gave for over 1,000 years is not the answer most people have been told today. But first, to answer the question of who Isaiah is describing, before we get to the ancient Jewish texts, we have to go further back. We have to go back to the very beginning of the Jewish library itself, because the portrait of the Messiah doesn't start with the prophets. It starts with the Torah and Genesis and Deuteronomy. And it starts in a place most people never think to look. It starts with a man named Joseph. You know that he's one of my favorites, right? Now, the common assumption is that the messianic line runs through Judah. It does. The Davidic Messiah, the king from the line of David, comes through Judah. That is very well established, and I'm not going to dispute it here. But there's a second thread running parallel to the Davidic line. Older than David and the monarchy itself, it runs through Joseph, real specifically through the tribe of Ephraim, through the northern tribes. And it describes a Messiah figure who does something the Davidic Messiah does not. He dies. Let me show you where it begins. Genesis chapter 49. Jacob is on his deathbed. He gathers his 12 sons and he speaks a prophetic blessing over each one. Some of them aren't so much a blessing. When he gets to Joseph, not Judah, remember I'm talking about Joseph here, he says this in verses 22 through 24. Joseph is a fruitful bow, even a fruitful bow by a well, whose branches run over the wall. The archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him, but his bow abode in strength. And the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. From the line of Joseph comes a shepherd, a stone, sent directly from the Almighty himself. The promise is made to Joseph before it's made to Judah. Now, in your Bible, your Old Testament, turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. This is a passage most people read right past. The chronicler is explaining why the birthright passed the way it did among the sons of Jacob. And he writes this. Now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was the firstborn. But for as much as he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given unto the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel. And the genealogy is not to be reckoned after the birthright. For Judah prevailed above his brethren, and of him came the chief ruler. But the birthright was Joseph's. That birthright then belonged to Joseph from that point forward. Most people reading that passage expect the chronicle to say Judah. The kingly line is Judah. The chief ruler is from Judah. But the birthright, the firstborn status, the preeminence, that belongs to Joseph. The two things are separate, and the distinction matters enormously for what comes next. Now go to Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 17. Moses is blessing the tribes of Israel just before his death. When he gets to Joseph, he says this, his glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns. With them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth. And they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. There are two animals in this verse. A firstling bullock, that's a firstborn domestic ox born into the sacrificial system. It's meant to or destined to die. And the second one is a ra'im, translated here as unicorn. Thank you, King James. A very cool picture. But the Hebrew word refers to something a little bit different. It's a wild ox. In fact, this particular type of ox is extinct. It was called an auroch. I may be mispronouncing that. An animal so ferocious and free, it had no place in Israel's sacrificial system. Nobody domesticated the ra'im or the auroch. Nobody put a yoke on it. It was sovereign unto itself. One figure, two stages, the firstborn ox who dies, transformed into the wild ox who cannot be conquered or tamed. This is death and resurrection described in the oldest blessing in the Torah, and it's spoken over Joseph. Now, here's something that almost never gets taught in Christian contexts. Joshua, he's the great military conqueror of Canaan. He's the man who led Israel into the promised land, was from the tribe of Joseph, from Ephraim. And the northern Ephraimite tribes had their own messianic expectation running alongside the Davidic line for centuries. Where the tribe of Judah looked for a second David, a king, the tribe of Joseph looked for a second Joshua, a conqueror, a redeemer, a Josephite Messiah. In Hebrew, Joshua and Jesus are the same name, Yeshua. The rabbis saw all of this. They built an entire tradition around it. They called this figure Mashiach ben Yosef, Messiah, the son of Joseph. And in scores of Talmudic texts, across hundreds of references, they described him in detail. He comes from Galilee. He's pierced. He dies at the gates of Jerusalem. His death atones for sin, and he is raised to life again. I'm going to get to all of that in just a minute. But the point right now is this. The template for a dying and rising Messiah is not a New Testament invention. It's not something the church reads back into the Hebrew scriptures after the fact. It's not a matter of hindsight. It's sitting in Genesis and Deuteronomy as plain as day. In the oldest text the Jewish people have, written over the life of Joseph. And the rabbis knew it was there the whole time. That's where the portrait begins. Let's watch what the prophets do with it in the next section. They pick that template up and they start adding detail because by the time the prophetic literature is done, this portrait has an address, a timeline, and even a cause of death. Let me start with Micah, chapter 5, verse 2. This is one of the most famous messianic prophecies in the Hebrew Bible. It says this, "But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting." The common understanding is that this is a prophecy about the Davidic Messiah, the king from the line of David, born in David's city. That's Bethlehem. And that is true as far as it goes. But here's something the standard reading leaves out. Bethlehem was Rachel's town before it was David's town. You might remember this little piece from Genesis. Rachel, the beloved wife of Jacob, the mother of Joseph and Benjamin, she died on the road to Bethlehem, giving birth to her second son. She's buried there. The city carries her memory. And the rabbinic tradition noticed that Micah's ruler is described not as a brother of the Judahites, but as a brother of the Josephites. Targum Jonathan, Rabbi David Kimchi, and Abarbanel all saw the Josephite connection in this prophecy. The birthplace points in two directions at once, toward David and toward Joseph. And the rabbis held both for a long time. Now move to Isaiah. We're going to be in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. It says this, "Nevertheless, the dimness shall not be such as was in her vexation, when at the first he lightly afflicted the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterward did more grievously afflict her by the way of the sea, beyond Jordan, in Galilee of the nations. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shined." Zebulun and Naphtali, the northern tribal territories, Josephite country. This is where the light appears first. This is where the messianic revelation begins. Let's go on to the Zohar, the foundational text of Jewish mysticism. It's explicit about this. It says the Messiah will reveal himself first in the land of Galilee, not in Jerusalem, not in the south, in Galilee, in the tribal territory of Joseph's descendants. Now back to the Old Testament, Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass. The rabbis apply this uniformly to the Messiah. Midrash Rabbah makes the connection explicit. As Moses, the first Redeemer, rode a donkey, so will the final Redeemer. Saadia Gahon, one of the most important rabbinic figures of the medieval period, says this verse shows the Messiah comes in humility, not on a war horse, but on a donkey. Now let's stay in Zechariah and flip over to chapter 12, verse 10. This one matters quite a bit. It says this, "And I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplications. They shall look upon me whom they have pierced." The Talmud in Tractate Sukkah, chapter 52a, applies this verse directly to Messiah ben Yosef, the Josephite Messiah. The mourning described in this passage is mourning for him, a pierced Messiah, in the Talmud, applied to a specific figure the rabbis had been tracking since Genesis. Now, we're going to go to Numbers chapter 24, verse 17 for the next piece. It says this, "I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh," or not near. "There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel." The rabbinic tradition developed this into a concrete expectation. The Pesikta, Sortata, records it plainly. In the week the Messiah is born, a bright star will appear in the east. This is out of the rabbinic tradition. Rabbi Lieva of Prague identifies the star of Jacob as the star of the King Messiah. Three independent rabbinic sources point in the same direction. A star announces the Messiah. But before I go on, I'm going to stop on one detail that makes most people pause when they see it. The Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin, chapter 97a, lays out a framework for the history of the world. It says the world exists for 6,000 years, 2,000 years of desolation, 2,000 years of Torah, and 2,000 years of the Messianic era. I'd also like to say, interestingly, at least to me, my video a couple of weeks ago called Midnight is Here echoes that exact same timeline. In fact, I'm not even the first one to come up with that. Since then, there's a guy named Irenaeus. You may have heard of him. He also held to the same exact timeline of 3 sets of 2,000-year eras. Anyway, back to this story. By the Jewish reckoning of years, the Jewish calendar, the current year is about 5,785. That means the Messianic era, the 2,000 years the Talmud assigns to the Messiah, was opened somewhere between 240 BC and 240 AD. That would be right around year 0, give or take a couple hundred years. At least that's when the window is open for the Messiah, according to the Messianic era in the Talmud. The Talmud's own timeline says the Messiah should have come and gone roughly 1,700 to 2,000 years ago. And Rabbi Moses Abraham Levi states plainly that the 9th chapter of Daniel is the only passage in all of Scripture where the timing of the Messiah's arrival is clearly and specifically fixed. So hang on to that for just a moment. The portrait the prophets are building now has a birthplace, a lineage, a manner of arrival, a donkey, a territory where he first appears, that would be the northern territory, a rejection, a piercing, a star that announces him, curiously, a star from the east, and a deadline that by the Jewish tradition's own reckoning has already passed, well, long past. The question of who fits that portrait is one I'm going to let you answer for yourself. And I think we probably would come to the same conclusion, at least based on those details there. Now I want to take you somewhere most people have never been, or at least most Christians have never been. The rabbis of the Talmudic period, the great scholars who built the canonical Jewish library between roughly 200 and 500 AD, they were not passive readers of the scriptures. They argued about everything. They debated endlessly. They wrote down their disagreements and they preserved them for generations. And in the middle of all that arguing and debating, they wrote down what they believed about the Messiah. What they wrote might catch you off guard a little bit. Let me start in the Babylonian Talmud. Tractate Sanhedrin, chapter 98b. The rabbis are having a discussion about the name of the Messiah. Different schools of thought are offering different answers, and then the text records this. The rabbis said, "His name is the leper scholar. As it is written, surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him a leper, smitten of God and afflicted." That's a direct citation of Isaiah 53, verse 4. It's in the canonical Talmud, applied by name to an individual Messiah, not Israel collectively, not to a nation, to a specific figure the rabbis called the leper scholar, because he bore the diseases of his people on himself. This is not a marginal text. It's not a footnote. This is sitting in the Babylonian Talmud in black and white. And it's been sitting there for over 1,500 years. Now let's look at the Zohar, the foundational text of Jewish mysticism. It's drawn from the teachings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Shemoth, section 2, page 212a. This page describes what the Messiah does in the Garden of Eden while Israel is in exile. The Messiah enters a certain hall in the Garden of Eden called the Hall of the Afflicted. There he calls for all the diseases and pains and sufferings of Israel, bidding them to settle on himself, which they do. And were it not that he thus eases the burden from Israel, taking it on himself, no one could endure the sufferings meted out to Israel in expiation on account of their neglect of the Torah. The Messiah voluntarily summons the suffering of his people and takes it onto his own body so that they don't have to bear it. That is Isaiah 53, verses 4 and 5, described in narrative form, applied to the Messiah by name and individual. In the Zohar, that would be the mystical texts. The texts the rabbis themselves considered among the holiest in their entire library. Now the Midrash Rabbah, the commentary on Lamentations, chapter 1, verse 16. Rabbi Abba ben Kahana is asked this: what is the name of the King Messiah? And then his answer is recorded this way: his name is the Lord, as it is stated. And this is his name whereby he shall be called the Lord of righteousness. That's the covenant name of God, Yahweh, applied to the Messiah in the Midrash. The rabbis looked at Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 6, and they said plainly, the Messiah carries the name of God himself. Now there's the Targums. The Targums are the ancient Aramaic translations of the Hebrew scriptures. They're used in synagogue readings across the Jewish world for centuries. Targum Jonathan on Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13, renders the opening of the servant passage this way. He says, behold, my servant the Messiah shall prosper. Not Israel, not a collective, the Messiah. That's what the Jewish communities were hearing read aloud in their synagogues before Rashi was born. That is the received translation of the passage in the ancient world. Now I want to show you something that connects all of this to a living tradition today. Inside Orthodox Jewish mystical teaching today, in Kabbalistic and Hasidic circles, the Messiah ben Yosef tradition is still being taught. It's not loud, it's not really that public of a discourse, but it's there. A rabbi teaching from within this tradition describes it this way: he is physically suffering. He carries what the tradition calls an oil or a yoke that decimates him. He's completely unrecognizable as who he is. He looks like a regular man. Nobody would suspect him. And then at the moment of his revelation, he reveals himself the way Joseph revealed himself to the brothers who had sold him into slavery. They're standing in front of the viceroy of Egypt, the most powerful man in the known world. He looks Egyptian. He speaks Egyptian. And then he clears the room and he says, Ani Yosef, I am Joseph. And the Torah says they were dumbstruck. They couldn't speak. That rabbi says that is the paradigm for how the Messiah ben Yosef reveals himself. The people who did not recognize him, who thought he was gone, standing in front of the one they overlooked. He never mentions Jesus of Nazareth, of course. He doesn't have to. Now, here's something I need to say directly because it's the hinge point of this entire video. There's a common assumption that the portrait of a suffering, dying, rising Messiah who voluntarily bears the sin of his people, that this is a portrait invented by Christian theologians reading back into the Hebrew scriptures after the fact. That the church constructed this narrative and imposed it on the text that never meant any such thing. The Talmud was not written by Christians. The Midrash was not written by Christians. The Zohar was not written by Christians. The Targum of Jonathan was not written by Christians. These texts were written by Jewish scholars for Jewish communities centuries before the Christian tradition had any influence over them. And they all described the same figure. The portrait was there the whole time. The rabbis saw it the whole time. They wrote it down. They preserved it in their canonical library. And then something happened. That's where we're going to go next in this story. Before I tell you what happened to that portrait, before I show you how it got buried, I want to show you something physical. This isn't just a story about texts and traditions and rabbis arguing in rooms. It's not just a story about manuscripts. This is hard, datable archaeological evidence sitting in museums right now that bears directly on this question. And it's evidence that no amount of institutional decision-making could touch, because it was sitting in a cave in the Judean desert for 2,000 years. In the year 1947 AD, a Bedouin shepherd boy is searching for a lost goat in the cliffs above the Dead Sea. He throws a rock into a cave to startle the animal to maybe get it to run out. But instead of the sound of a goat, he hears something shatter. So he goes in to investigate. Inside the cave, he finds clay jars. Inside the jars, he finds scrolls. And what he found that day would become the greatest manuscript discovery in the history of modern archaeology. We call those the Dead Sea Scrolls. Surely you've probably heard that phrase before. Among those scrolls is one that matters more than almost any other for the question we're asking today. It's called the Great Isaiah Scroll. Its catalog number is 1QISA-A. It's the oldest complete manuscript of the book of Isaiah ever found. It was copied sometime before the year 100 BC. It predates the birth of Christ by about 100 years. It predates Rashi by over 1,100 years. It sits today in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem in a room called the Shrine of the Book, where it's been on display since about 1965. And Isaiah 53 in that scroll reads exactly the way it reads in your Bible today. You probably thought I was going to say it said something different, right? Nope. The text is intact. The singular pronouns are intact. Every verse describing the individual figure who suffers, who's pierced, who bears the iniquities of his people, who is cut off from the land of the living, and then sees the travail of his soul and is satisfied. It is all there, unchanged since 100 BC. There's no ancient manuscript tradition that supports a collective reading of Isaiah 53, despite modern translations in that way, or interpretations rather. The oldest physical evidence of the text of Isaiah points in one direction and in one direction only. The shift in interpretation was never in the scroll. It was always in the reader. Now, there is one more detail about the great Isaiah scroll that's worth pausing on. At Isaiah chapter 52, verse 14, the scroll contains a variant reading from the standard Masoretic texts. Where the standard text reads, "His visage was so marred more than any man," the Qumran scribe wrote something slightly different, a reading that scholars translate as, "I anointed his appearance." The scribe who copied this scroll appears to have understood the passage as describing a divinely appointed individual. The community at Qumran was reading Isaiah 53 as a messianic text before Jesus of Nazareth was born, which is not surprising at all. The Qumran community was a group of Essenes and very much focused on the coming Messiah. Now I want to show you another scroll from the same caves. The catalog number is 4Q372. I'm telling you those catalog numbers so you can look them up yourself if you'd like, by the way. Scholars call it the Joseph Apocryphon. It dates to before 200 BC. That means it was written at least 2 centuries before the birth of Christ. It presents a figure who is explicitly called Joseph. This figure is suffering. He's dying. The context, though, is an attack on Jerusalem. And in his death throes, he cries out to God, whom he addresses as his Father. And he predicts that he will rise again in glory. A dying and rising Josephite Messiah figure. It's in writing in a cave near the Dead Sea, 200 years before Jesus of Nazareth is born. That's not Christian theology, by the way. That's pre-Christian Jewish expectation, written down and preserved in clay jars until a shepherd boy threw a rock into a cave 1900 years later. Now I want to show you one more piece of evidence, and this one comes not from the ground, but from translation tradition. Around 250 BC, Jewish scholars in Alexandria translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. This translation is called the Septuagint, and it became the most widely used version of the Jewish scriptures in the ancient world. I've done a couple of videos on this in the members section on my channel. These were Jewish scholars working for a Jewish community with no Christian agenda of any kind. In fact, they predated Christianity by a couple hundred years. Their rendering of Isaiah 53 is individual, not collective. It's a messianic in character. There is no collective reading in the Septuagint at all. The oldest Jewish translation of Isaiah 53 into another language reads it as a description of an individual figure, again, not collective Israel. Now, here's why all of this physical evidence matters so much for what I'm about to show you. Around 248 AD, a church father named Origen documents something interesting. He's having a discussion with a Jewish interlocutor, and this Jewish man offers an interpretation of Isaiah 53 that Origen had not heard before. He says the passage refers to Israel collectively, to the nation as a whole, not to an individual. Origen records this as a novelty, as something new. He treats it as a counter-argument being deployed in a debate, not as an ancient received tradition. This is the first documented appearance of the collective interpretation of Isaiah 53 in a historical record. Not in the Talmud, not in any ancient manuscript, in a debate as a response to Christian arguments. nearly 3 centuries after Jesus of Nazareth. Now let's look at Justin Martyr, writing around 155 AD, about 100 years before Origen. He records a dialogue with a Jewish man named Trypho. And Trypho does not deny that Isaiah 53 describes the Messiah. His objection is specifically to the cross, to the death by crucifixion, which he argues is cursed under the law. The argument at that stage is about how the Messiah suffered, not about whether the servant was the Messiah at all. The collective interpretation of Isaiah 53 has no ancient home. It's not in the oldest manuscripts, it's not in the oldest translations, it's not in the earliest Jewish Christian debates. It appears first as a polemic counterargument in the middle of the 3rd century AD. And that raises the question I've been building toward this entire video. If the ancient sources all pointed in one direction, if the Talmud named the Messiah the leper scholar and cited Isaiah 53, if the Zohar described him taking Israel's suffering onto himself, if the Targums translated Isaiah 53:13 as the Messiah shall prosper, if the Dead Sea Scrolls preserved the text unchanged, how did the mainstream Jewish reading of Isaiah 53 end up where it is today? That's what I'm going to show you now. I want to say something before I go any further into this video. I said it at the beginning, and it bears repeating here again. What happened to this portrait of a Messiah was not a conspiracy, or at least it doesn't have any signs of being a conspiracy. There was no council of rabbis sitting in a room deciding to deceive their people. There was no coordinated effort to hide the truth from the Jewish community. What happened was something far more human and, in many ways, far more heartbreaking. What happened was the cloud of grief, a series of catastrophic wounds inflicted on a people across several centuries, each one producing an institutional response that moved the tradition one step further from what the ancient sources were actually saying. The ordinary Jewish person living through any of these moments had no idea what was happening at the scholarly level. They were just trying to survive. They received what their leaders handed them, and their leaders were doing what leaders do under pressure. They were protecting their communities the only way that they knew how. This is the story of those wounds, really. The first wound is in 135 AD. Rabbi Akiva, one of the most celebrated figures in the entire history of Jewish scholarship, he declares a military leader named Simon Bar Kokhba to be the Messiah. The name Bar Kokhba means son of a star. It's a deliberate reference to the messianic prophecy in Numbers 24, verse 17. Akiva believes this is the moment. The Messiah has come. The Romans will be driven out. The temple will be rebuilt. Remember, it was torn down in 70 AD. This revolt fails catastrophically. The Roman Emperor Hadrian brings the full force of the empire down on Judea. The death toll is staggering. Historians estimate hundreds of thousands killed. Jerusalem is plowed under, salted, and rebuilt as a Roman city called Aela Capitolina. Jews are banned from entering it entirely. The Bar Kokhba revolt is one of the most devastating events in Jewish history. And in the aftermath of that catastrophe, a suffering, dying Messiah becomes theologically dangerous. If the Messiah dies, if that is part of the portrait, then Bar Kokhba's death doesn't disqualify him. It could be reframed as part of the plan. And that is not a direction the surviving rabbinic leadership wants to go. The community cannot survive another false Messiah. It cannot afford another revolt. The first deflections of the suffering language in Isaiah 53 away from an individual Messiah begin appearing in the Aramaic Targums around this period. Not a full reinterpretation, just a softening, a blurring of the edges of suffering, the beginning of a long process. The second wound is the pressure of Jewish-Christian debate between roughly 200 and 500 AD. As Christianity spreads across the Roman world, Jewish and Christian scholars find themselves in increasingly heated arguments about the Hebrew Scriptures. Remember, it was during this period that Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Christians use Isaiah 53 constantly in this period. It's one of their primary arguments for Jesus as Messiah. Every time a Jewish scholar sits across from a Christian debater, Isaiah 53 is on the table. The rabbinic response to the Christian use of Isaiah 53 over and over is entirely predictable. When your opponent keeps picking up a weapon and hitting you with it, you look for a way to take that weapon off the table. The collective interpretation of Isaiah 53, the reading that says the servant is Israel as a nation, not an individual, begins developing as a counter-argument in this period. Not because the text demands it, because the debate demands it. As I showed you in the last section, Origen documents this reading appearing for the first time around 248 AD in a debate context as a response to Christian arguments. It has no textual home. It's a polemic move, polemic meaning an argument against. And it's an entirely understandable one given the pressure Jewish communities were under at the time. The third wound happens around 1096 AD, and this is the one that changes everything. The First Crusade is rolling across Europe toward Jerusalem. As it moves, it picks up a shadow. Mobs of crusaders and their followers who decide that before they go kill Muslims in the Holy Land, they'll deal with the Jews living among them in Europe. In the spring of 1096, these mobs sweep through Jewish communities of the Rhine Valley. Speyer, Worms, Mainz, Cologne. The massacres are horrific. Entire communities are given a choice to convert or to die. Remember, just recently in one of my member videos, I talked about the Augustinian doctrine of compulsion. Well, here we see it raised with its most horrific edge toward the Jews. Many choose death rather than conversion. The accounts from this period are among the most harrowing in Jewish history. Thousands are killed within weeks. And in the immediate aftermath of these massacres, the most influential rabbi in Jewish history sits down to write his commentary on the Torah. His name is Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, but he's known by his initials as Rashi. Born in 1040, died in 1105. His commentaries on the Torah and the Talmud became so authoritative that for 1,000 years after his death, studying the Torah in Jewish tradition meant studying Rashi. His words shaped Jewish interpretation more than any other single figure in the post-Talmudic period. In his Torah commentary, written after 1096, Rashi interprets the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 as Israel collectively, the nation, the people, not an individual Messiah. In Rashi's own commentary on the Talmud, written before his Torah commentary, before the massacres of 1096, he applies Isaiah 53 to an individual Messiah. On Tractate Sanhedrin 98a, where the Talmud describes the Messiah sitting among the poor and sick, Rashi writes this: "He is even stricken himself, as it is written, and he was pierced because of our transgressions, and our sicknesses he carried." He cites Isaiah 53:4 and verse 5, applied to the individual Messiah in his own handwriting, in his own Talmud commentary. The same rabbi, the same texts, two different readings. And the massacres of 1096 happen in between. Rashi is not a villain in this story. He's a man watching his people being slaughtered in the streets of the Rhine Valley. He's a Jewish scholar trying to make sense of incomprehensible suffering. And the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, a figure who bears the wounds inflicted by others, who carries the grief of his people, who is despised and rejected and acquainted with sorrow. That figure begins to look in the shadow of 1096 like the Jewish people themselves. The reading he reached for in that moment of grief was a lifeline for a traumatized community. The tragedy is that it became a wall that his descendants would live behind for 1,000 years, unable to see what was on the other side. Other rabbis begin to follow Rashi's lead. The collective reading spreads through the medieval rabbinic world like a consensus, like as if everyone just simply agrees. The fourth wound is Maimonides, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, the Rambam. He's the greatest legal mind in post-Talmudic Jewish history. Writing in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, he codifies Jewish law and theology into a systematic framework that becomes the authoritative standard for Jewish belief. And in that framework, a suffering, dying Messiah is definitionally impossible. The Messiah, according to Maimonides, must be a human king, a military conqueror, a rebuilder of the temple, a gatherer of the exiles. If a messianic candidate dies before accomplishing these things, he's disqualified. And now I want to show you the most dramatic single moment in this entire history. It's 1263 AD in the city of Barcelona. The King of Aragon has convened a formal public disputation between Jewish and Christian scholars. On the Christian side, a Dominican friar named Pablo Cristiani. On the Jewish side, one of the greatest Talmudic minds of the medieval period, Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, known as Ramban or Nachmanides. The Dominicans press the question that is at the center of this entire debate. They want Ramban to acknowledge that the Messiah must die, because if the Messiah must die, then a dead Messiah is not automatically disqualified, and their argument for Jesus gains traction. Ramban stands up before the court, before the king, before assembled scholars, and he swears, Nowhere in Jewish literature does the Messiah die. He's being technically precise. He's speaking specifically about Messiah ben David, the Davidic Messiah, and that statement, narrowly defined, is technically accurate. But Ramban knows the entire Messiah ben Yosef tradition. He's read the Talmud. He knows Tractate Sukkah 52a, where Zechariah 12:10 is applied to the pierced Josephite Messiah. He knows the scores of texts describing a dying and rising Josephite figure. He knows all of it, and he keeps every word of it off the table. The suppression in that moment is not institutional inertia. It's not the gradual drift of tradition under pressure. It's a deliberate decision made by a brilliant man in a high-stakes room. And it works. The Dominicans never get the concession they were looking for. But the cost is that one of the most important witnesses to the dying Messiah tradition in all of Jewish literature, a figure with the authority of Ramban, goes on record denying that it exists. That record stands for centuries. By the time you reach the modern period, today, the collective interpretation of Isaiah 53 is so thoroughly established as the mainstream Jewish position that most Jewish people have never even heard that any other reading ever existed. They've never been told what Sanhedrin 98b says. They've never read the Hall of the Afflicted in the Zohar. They've never seen Targum Jonathan's rendering of Isaiah 52:13. They simply received what their institutions handed to them. And then, in 1947, a shepherd boy throws a rock into a cave. The great Isaiah scroll comes out of the ground. The oldest manuscript evidence for Isaiah 53 is sitting in a jar waiting, unchanged, pointing in the same direction it has always pointed. In the tradition, the living, breathing Orthodox Jewish mystical tradition kept something too. The Messiah ben Yosef is still being taught in Kabbalistic circles today, a suffering, unrecognizable figure carrying an unbearable weight, transformed through that suffering, revealing himself in a moment that leaves everyone speechless. The portrait survived. That is where I want to end. But before I close, I want to come back to the question I asked at the beginning of this video. If you had nothing but the ancient Jewish texts, no New Testament, no church fathers, no Christian theology of any kind, what would you expect the Messiah to look like? Here's what the sources say. He comes from the line of Joseph, born in Bethlehem, Rachel's town. He appears first in Galilee, in the tribal territory of Joseph's descendants. He arrives in Jerusalem on a donkey, in humility, not on a war horse. He's rejected. He becomes a stumbling block to his own people. He's pierced. He voluntarily takes his suffering of Israel onto himself. His name is Yahweh, the covenant name of God. He draws not just Israel, but all nations to worship. He arrives within a specific window of time that the Talmud's own reckoning places between 240 BC and 240 AD, right in the middle. He dies, and then most significantly, he rises again. That portrait I just painted in words was assembled from the Torah, the prophets of the Old Testament, the Talmud, the Midrash, the Targums, and the Zohar. Every brushstroke was applied by Jewish scholars in Jewish texts for Jewish communities across thousands of years of Jewish scholarship. And then the wounds came. Bar Kokhba, the polemic pressure of debate, the massacres of 1096, Rashi's grief, Maimonides' legal framework, Ramban's silence in Barcelona, each one burying a little more of the portrait until most of the people who were its rightful heirs had never seen it before. But we can see now that it's still surviving. It survived in caves near the Dead Sea, sealed in clay jars, waiting for a shepherd boy to throw a rock. It survived in the Talmud, where Sanhedrin 98b still names the Messiah the leper scholar and cites Isaiah 53. It survived in the Zohar, where the Hall of the Afflicted still describes a Messiah who takes his people's suffering onto himself. It survived in the Orthodox Jewish mystical teaching, where a rabbi today still describes the moment of messianic revelation as Ani Yosef, I am Joseph, and the ones who missed him standing speechless in front of the one they overlooked. The portrait has survived. And Isaiah, writing 700 years before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, writing in a scroll that would sit unchanged in a cave for 2,000 years, asked the question that sits at the center of all of it. Who hath believed our report? And to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of dry ground. He hath no form nor comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief. and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. Who is that? The ancient Jewish scholars knew the answer. They wrote it down. They preserved it in their most sacred texts. And for 1,000 years, the weight of grief and pressure and institutional self-protection kept most of their descendants from ever reading it. And today, you have read it yourself.